In this video, we're going to show you why the 5th generation of Chevrolet Corvette is the best performance value out there. And to do so, we've bought one. Case, tell them about it.
We just bought this 1999 C5 Corvette with 40,000 miles for $14,000. And this is so much car for that money. And to show you how much car you get, let's pop the hood.
This generation of Corvette came out for the 1997 model year, and one of the biggest changes from C4 generation to C5 was the engine. So the old C4 used a version of the LT, and this was one of the early iterations in the C5 Corvette of the LS. This is an LS1 5.7 liter small block Chevy V8. Now the LS engine, of course, is infamous. It's an all aluminum design, and in this application it made 345 horsepower and 350 pound-feet of torque.
Of course, Corvettes are largely about what's under the hood, but another classic element of the Corvette is what you can do with the roof. Now, there were a couple different body styles of the C5. There was a fixed roof coupe, there was a convertible with a soft top, and there was this standard coupe. And of course, as is very classic with these cars, you can pull this hardtop off. So with a couple of simple latches, look at that, we can pull this top off, and I'll grab Tommy's help, but let's make this a convertible. And let me pop the back hatch so that we can show you the cool spot where you get to store your roof panel inside the car. Oh, which way do we want to go here? Do you got it?
Oh yeah.
Oh, yeah, that is light. Yeah, I bet you could do that as a individual if you wanted to.
Yeah.
But the paint's nice on this car. We won't spoil it. So this is very cool. There are these pins here that latch the roof in place so that, I mean, if you're doing some performance driving, you can have this roof panel in here and it's not going to slide around or anything. Plus, you still get a little bit of storage.
The overall design of the C5 Corvette started in the early 1990s, but budgetary constraints and other factors meant that this car was pretty delayed in coming to market. But there were a number of big improvements C5 compared to the previous generation. Now, one of the big changes that Chevrolet did was not only the backbone structure, but the placement of the transmission. This vehicle runs a transaxle, and what that means is that you have the engine in the front and then a torque tube that runs to the transmission / axle in the rear, or transaxle. Now, regardless of whether or not you got the manual or the automatic, you got that rear mounted transaxle, which really helped with weight distribution.
Another major improvement with the 5th generation Corvette is the ingress and egress. As you can see, the sill right here is well below the seat height. And in the C4 Corvette, I can say from experience, that sill is very high. So in order to get into the car, you kind of have to fall into the seat. This, if you're an older driver, which a lot of Corvette owners are, this is really easy to get in and out of. Inside of the C5 Corvette is one of the bigger points of contention. This is not a spectacular interior. I will say it's decently durable, holds up pretty well over time. This doesn't look a whole lot different than it would have from new, but man, does it feel cheap in here. I mean, these switches are just the worst of GM's plasticky build quality, and like, I mean, look at this. It's honestly, I will say, it's a better made interior than my C4 Corvette, but somehow it feels cheaper. I mean, I would say that this is better screwed together than my car, but it feels even worse. So, not a spectacular place to sit.
Now, before we start talking about some of the cool gadgets and gizmos on the inside of the Corvettes, I want to talk to you about these stickers on the inside of the glove box of GM vehicles. These are fantastic. These are little RPO codes, and with these little alphanumeric codes, you can tell exactly what options your car had from the factory, which is fantastic. This one has a couple of cool ones and a couple of rather lame ones. Let's get into that now.
Code F45 gets you this option right here. This is ride control, so it changes your shock tuning depending if you want the car to be stiffer in its ride or slightly softer. And in a moment when we get on the road, we'll tell you how much of a difference we can feel between the modes. But a lot of guys in C5 Corvettes didn't like this feature because when it stops working, it can be very expensive to fix. However, it is actually working on our car.
One of the options we have on our C5 Corvette is the automatic climate control. And this is pretty interesting, right? Because you can set the temperature and then let the car figure out how to maintain that temperature. But what I think is so funny about the system is It's dual zone, but only one zone is automatic. So the driver's side you can set the temperature to. The passenger side also has an adjustment, but it's just a simple cold, hot dial. There's no automatic function. How much more expensive would it have been to give the passenger that selection as well? I just think that is one of the funniest examples of cost cutting I've seen in a while.
Another option our car has is the CD player. Very high tech for its time, I'm sure. And a few cool items on this head unit. So you have an equalizer here that you can flip through a couple different presets depending on what kind of music you're listening to. Pop, jazz, there's rock, there's classic, news. But you can also go in and you can change some of your equalizer settings with these knobs that pop out, so you can twist them by hand and then they pop back in so they're nice and flush. And the tune knob is even that way.
The seats in the C5 Corvette, there were a couple of different designs depending on which configuration you got. This is by far the most dreary interior color option. It's just kind of flat gray. You could also get it in bright red, which was much cooler. And then our car also has the option for the power seats, so you can move them backward and forward. You also have a bunch of lumbar adjustments, which works quite well. The other thing too is that these seats have held up very, very nicely. They're pretty durable.
Now, just because this is a high performance automobile doesn't mean you don't get some practical features like a cup holder. And this is maybe the world's worst cup holder. I mean, look at how low this is. It would not take much of the C5's massive acceleration to tip the cup right onto your ride control button. But because this cup holder is so terrible, there's a common aftermarket modification, which this car has. One of its few modifications is this cup holder. You can tell it's not the factory GM plastic because it doesn't quite match. It's also not really that well secured. So I'm not sure I would trust this any more than that cup holder. But worst case scenario, you do have a couple places to put cups.
The gauges in the C5 Corvette really are very cool. So one of the big complaints, especially about the early C4s, were the digital gauges. Chevrolet learned their lesson and they went much more simple in the gauge design of the C5. But what's cool about it is the different pods are actually offset on different planes. So it gives it a very futuristic look and I think works really, really well. But that isn't the only cool part about the gauges. You actually have this little screen right here underneath the gauges, which is like your little warning information center, but it shows you a bunch of cool things. So for example, let's check out like fuel economy. You can also see various gauges, including oil pressure, oil temperature, coolant temperature, trans fluid, battery volts. There's different trip computers, a bunch of different options. And then you can even go from metric to miles an hour. So you can go between mph and kilometers an hour there on the speedometer, and it goes to 200. So you can go to 200 miles an hour, which is 200 miles an hour, or 200 kilometers an hour, which is like what, 130 something, 140 maybe. So that's pretty funky. The other cool thing you can do though is if I push and hold, I think it's option and fuel, I can actually go through and check out the various codes that are stored in this car. So if you had warning codes, they would show up in that screen as well.
This car does have a very plasticky interior, but not all of the buttons and interior are plasticky. Some of it is rubbery. So these switches all have this rubber coating, which I would imagine probably helps you not break any of this if water gets on it, but it does not feel fantastic. So it kind of matches the rest of the car in that way. Yeah, very cheap and very weird.
So one of the interesting design elements of the C5 Corvette are, of course, the iconic pop-up headlights. Now, previous generations of Corvette had them as well. Now, the C4 did this weird little swirl thing. The C5 just pop up and down, much more simple design and probably much more reliable as well. It's also, fun fact, the last car ever sold here in the US with pop-up headlights. 2004 was the last model year.
Well, we looked a little bit at the shoddy interior quality, but they didn't reserve that for the inside. You know, the same is true all the way around this car. I mean, any car that's made primarily out of composite is going to be this way. It's part of what makes this car very lightweight, part of what makes it easily motivated by that 5.7 liter V8, but it is funny to just go around and see how squishy the whole car is. It's like a big pillow.
Now that SMC composite material isn't only reserved for the body. In the floor, you not only have a composite material, but a balsa wood sandwich. So it's a composite with a pretty thick layer of balsa wood, which they found to be really strong and of course lightweight, and then another composite material in this little sandwich, which is kind of a fun fact about the C5 Corvette. One of the biggest things we learned about driving this Corvette around for just a couple of days is it's a very low car, like an extremely low car. This car is on its original suspension, but it still scrapes over everything, and that is partly by design. Now, there's a 3-piece front apron on this car, but the middle section is actually designed to scrape on stuff. It has these little springs in it to bounce back to its original position. You can kind of hear them there when I move it back and forth. So even though it feels like you're scraping over everything, you're probably not doing damage unless you feel that metallic clunk of like metal.
Best thing about this car is that exhaust note.
It is pretty awesome, isn't it? Yeah, this car has an aftermarket exhaust. That and the cup holder are the only two mods, which is either very common on C5 Corvettes or very uncommon, because a lot of folks bought these and made like 1,000 horsepower out of them, or tried to.
Yeah, it's kind of like you said, one way or another. It's either an old guy who bought the car brand new for exactly what it was and kept it that way and kept it in really, really great condition, or somebody young who bought it for its power potential and then they modified the hell out of it. This is an old guy Corvette for sure.
It is kind of the one you want, to be honest.
It
and
is.
then if you do want to modify it, you can do it at your own leisure.
Man, this car is nice and torquey, but it's not only power at the bottom end. If you stay in the throttle, it rewards you for staying in it, because that power builds at the top end, which is kind of the big difference between the character of this engine and the character of like the V8 that you would find in a Suburban or something.
Yeah, and the other thing too is, like you mentioned, peak torque is I think 4,400 RPM. So unlike some of the older Corvettes, like the LT models, this engine really rewards you for pushing it, you know, into the higher RPMs.
I will say that the automatic transmission in this car does kind of neuter the experience, because it's just an old school slush box automatic, so it makes the whole powertrain feel kind of squishy, even though this engine is powerful.
Yeah, 345 horsepower. Now this automatic is called the 4L60E, and it certainly is one of the more depressing parts about the driving experience of this Corvette. Now, of course, you could get this car with a 6-speed manual, but from our search of C4 Corvettes, it seems like, or sorry, C5, it seems like the vast majority of the autos.
Yeah, this is back when that was a luxury feature. It's something that people wanted, so it's kind of hard to find manuals. But I will say, this car, in terms of handling, I mean, it's wide, it's got wide tires, not a lot of body roll, and it's not an uncomfortable car to ride in. So right now we're in Tour, which is the more comfortable shock setting, and we can slide all the way to Performance. It's kind of hard to tell a difference. It's not a night and day difference here with the shocks.
No, it isn't. Now, of course, there were more high-performance versions of the C5 Corvette. There was like the Z51 package, and then there was, of course, the Z06, which is legendary now.
Yeah.
This is kind of just your standard run-of-the-mill runabout Corvette that happens to have this ride control feature. It's not as technologically advanced as some of the newer GM ride controls, right, that use a little magnetic fluids, but it's still kind of a fun blast from the past. I will say, so I autocross a Mini, and I feel like I'm pretty sporty in the Mini, and then some guy always shows up in like a bone stock C5 Corvette on good tires and just blows the doors off like 9 times out of 10.
Yeah, I mean, you've got so much under the hood, and again, it's such a wide car, so little body roll that, like you said, if you put a sticky set of tires on one of these, you've got yourself a beastly car, because they're not overly heavy, especially for how much power they make. And yeah, it's just a lot of performance for $14,000. It's just not that much money.
And you got to consider, right, so 3,245 pounds is the curb weight, 345 horsepower. Back in the day, this car was said to have a top speed of like 170 miles an hour, 0 to 60 in like the low 5-second territory. So, I mean, we're talking, even by modern day standards, a pretty high performance car. And the funniest thing about this one, so automatic, I think it's got 2 73 gears in the rear end.
Yeah.
Which means the gears are enormously long.
Yeah, so on the highway, going 75 miles an hour, you're turning, what, close to 1,700 RPM, which means that fuel economy around town is abysmal. But on the highway, these cars are actually more efficient than you would think.
We're talking like 18 to 20 miles per gallon, and maybe even more if you drive it nicely. This car is actually so fuel efficient, they completely avoided the gas guzzler tax from the late 1990s, which is pretty fantastic for folks buying it new. Now, what are some of the big downsides of this C5?
Well, obviously, like we talked about, the interior, not phenomenal. Also, from our perspective, not our favorite looking car,
Yeah,
you say?
I agree. Yeah, it's a little rolly 1990s pulley, yeah.
It's a little dumpy, but you know, I think really the big advantage that you get with this car, and there's this rule of thumb that car people usually go by, where you can have cars that are fast, you can have cars that are cheap, and cars that are reliable, but you gotta pick two. You can't have all three.
Yeah.
These are cars, and of course, you know, what you call fast, that's a sliding scale. It depends on who you ask. So a lot of people would say that this car isn't fast. By most people's standards, this car is fast. So
Sure.
This kind of breaks that scale, because this is an LS1 engine, plenty reliable. It's one of the reasons that people swap these into so many cars. Well, this comes with it from the factory. They are pretty cheap, and that's also a sliding scale. It depends on who you ask. But 14 grand, not that expensive. A lot of power and handling for that amount of money, and relatively reliable. So it's kind of a cool option just because of that.
And they built 248,000 of them, so they're out there. Parts are extremely gettable. Even local part shops will have a lot of the stuff you need to keep an LS on the road. There's only there's one thing which I think is funny, and we did talk about this, but on the C5 Corvette, which is really unreliable. These early ones had something called passive entry, and on the main key there's a switch where you can put it to passive. And it was really advanced. You'd walk up to the car and it would unlock, and they were horrible. So they got rid of that in the model year 2000. And apart from like some stuff on like the early C5s with some of the ABS modules desoldering themselves, I mean, case one's a Corvette, slightly older, but even still, like, anything is out there. Yeah. And anything that could be done to a Corvette has been done. So if you want to make power, it's all on the forums.
Yeah, the information is there, the parts are there, and like, you know, you've said before, it is possible to buy these cars well, and it's possible to not buy these cars well. So definitely, I'm sure it's happened to plenty of people where they buy one of these cars and it's been ragged on, it's been abused, and they ended up having to pour a good bit of money into maintenance. But generally, this is a solid powertrain, something that if you don't live in a snowy climate like Colorado where we are, you could potentially daily this.
And it sounds amazing, right? This guy put just a little aftermarket back box on there.
Yeah.
And it sounds like hell freezing over. It's incredible.
Whether you love them or absolutely hate them, you have to admit that the C5 Corvette for $14,000 in this kind of condition is an absolute bargain, especially considering the potential for performance that you get out of this car. It's just not that much money for how much you have under the hood and how much potential this chassis has for handling. So there's going to be a lot more videos coming with this C5 down the pipeline, including a drag race between it and my C4 Corvette. So stay tuned to TFL Classics, and we'll catch you all in the next video.